Tonight, we pull back a curtain that was never meant to move. Not myths, not fairy tales, but a hidden record of beings said to walk beside us since the dawn of civilization. The Vatican calls them angels and demons, but behind those names lies a story far stranger, one stitched together with censored books, erased visions, and rituals stripped of their meaning. For centuries, the Church has preached a simple tale of light against darkness. But the truth is that these intelligences followed laws, thresholds, and patterns the world was never meant to see. Stories of watchers, guardians, and fallen ones were not lost. They were reshaped, edited, until only fragments survived in scripture and art. What was left out are the mechanics, the rules, the knowledge that contact was once possible without permission. And those who stumbled too close to that truth either vanished into silence or were branded heretics. The Vatican's greatest fear was never disbelief, but the moment ordinary people realized that the doors to the unseen could open without a priest. Tonight we trace that fear. Tonight we step into the forbidden truth about angels and demons the Vatican hid. Like the video, subscribe. Because once you hear this story, you will never see the heavens the same way again. A door hidden deep inside the Vatican has no lock that the public can see, yet it has kept its secrets sealed for centuries. Behind it, whispers say, lies a very different story of angels and demons, a story never told from the pulpit, a story too dangerous for the faithful to hear. We are taught that angels are radiant beings of light sent to protect us, and demons are shadows crawling from hell to tempt and torment. But what if that simple picture was not the truth? What if the real story was stranger, more unsettling, and carefully hidden so that no one could ever question the official tale? The moment you begin to search, you realize that silence has been louder than scripture. For thousands of years, churches have painted images of wings, halos, and fire. They have warned about fallen ones cast out of heaven, forever chained in darkness. But the oldest stories, long before the church, speak of watchers who descended, teachers who shared forbidden knowledge, beings who blurred the line between divine and monstrous. Why would such accounts vanish? Why were they erased from sermons and buried under marble floors? Some say it is because truth does not make faith stronger, it makes faith fragile. Imagine sitting in a cathedral in the year 1500, staring at stained glass glowing in the sunday. You are told angels are messengers of God, pure and unquestionable. But in secret rooms nearby, bishops debate manuscripts that describe angels who defied orders, who mingled with humans, who left traces of impossible knowledge. These accounts are not shared because they are too dangerous. They raise questions no priest can answer without shaking the foundation of belief. What if demons were not always enemies? What if the line between angels and demons was drawn not by heaven, but by men? History reminds us that those in power decide what is sacred and what is forbidden. A story told from the pulpit becomes holy. A story locked away becomes heresy. When Rome fell in the 5th century, chaos spread, but one institution remained steady, the Church. It took control not only of souls, but of memory itself. Books that spoke of angelic beings teaching astronomy, medicine, or hidden laws of the earth were quietly removed. Legends of spirits that guided rather than destroyed were pushed aside. Only one version survived, the version that placed the Church between mankind and the unseen world. To understand why, imagine the danger of unfiltered truth. If people believed they could speak to angels without the Church, would priests still hold authority? If demons were seen not as pure evil but as misunderstood intelligences, would the lines of fear and obedience still work? By shaping the story, the Vatican ensured its role as the guardian of both heaven and earth. Yet, cracks still show. Fragments of the Book of Enoch, lines of forgotten Gospels, secret testimonies from exorcists all suggest that the truth is far more complex. angels that rebelled but also protected, demons that punished but also revealed knowledge, a spectrum of beings beyond simple good and evil. Tonight, let us open that hidden door. Let us step into the cold light of forbidden truth, where angels and demons are not what we were told, and where silence has been the strongest sermon of all. When you hear the word angel, you probably picture a glowing figure with wings and a halo. When you hear the word demon, you imagine horns, claws, and fire. These images feel timeless, but they are not. They were chosen, standardized, and carefully protected by the Church. The truth is that in the earliest stories, these beings had many names, some beautiful, some terrifying, and some that defy easy explanation. Long before the Vatican placed its seal on the language of faith, older cultures spoke of watchers, messengers, guardians, daemons, and spirits of the air. These were not locked into simple categories of good or evil. A daemon in ancient Greece, for example, was not a monster. It was a guiding intelligence, something like a personal spirit that could lead someone toward wisdom or destruction, depending on how it was treated. In Mesopotamia, stories told of shining beings who moved between heaven and earth, carrying knowledge of stars and farming. In Hebrew writings, the word malak meant messenger, not a winged warrior, but a traveller between realms. None of these words meant the same thing as the neat boxes we know today. So what happened? As Christianity rose in power, words became weapons. To protect the flock, the Church began simplifying a very complicated spiritual world. Anything declared angel was safe, holy, and under God's command. Anything declared demon was rejected, feared, and condemned. In this way, the vocabulary of heaven and hell became black and white. But in that process, countless older names quietly disappeared. Imagine sitting in a monastery in the year 600, copying a manuscript by candlelight. You see a word like daimon, but your superior tells you to replace it with demon. You see a reference to the Watchers, but you are told it is heresy. Cross it out, write angel instead. Over centuries, these edits built a new dictionary for the unseen, one controlled by Rome. Even the word angel itself changed. In older languages, it meant only messenger, someone carrying a message from the divine, no more, no less. The Church, however, reshaped it into a glowing, flawless being of perfect obedience. This gave the faithful one clear image to pray to, and it gave the Church one clear role as the only interpreter of their voices. The same happened with demon. A daimon, a spirit guide, even a trickster being from folk tradition, all were recast as evil. Once the name was fixed, there was no room for discussion. Every daimon, no matter its role, became a threat to be exorcised. Every watcher became a fallen one. Every strange name was buried under the blanket of silence. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, the world had been divided into two camps: angels to be loved, demons to be feared. But beneath the surface, older names still lingered, hidden in apocryphal texts, whispered in villages, scratched into the margins of banned manuscripts. These are the names the Vatican retired because they opened too many doors that could lead to a more complicated, less controllable truth. And if words shape belief, then by changing the words, the Church reshaped reality itself. Long before the rise of the Vatican, before popes and priests stood as gatekeepers of heaven and hell, there were older stories that described beings who watched, who descended, who moved between worlds. These beings were not called angels or demons yet. They were known as watchers. In Mesopotamia, carved onto clay tablets thousands of years before Christ, there are tales of shining figures who descended from the sky to teach humankind. They brought knowledge of stars, agriculture, even the secrets of measuring time. Some were called Apkallu, half human and half divine, guardians who emerged after the Great Flood. They were not seen as monsters, they were revered as teachers. In Hebrew tradition, fragments of the Book of Enoch speak of watchers who came down from heaven to walk among men. These watchers taught writing, medicine, metallurgy, and enchantments. They gave gifts of knowledge, but they also broke divine boundaries. Some fell in love with human women and created children who were said to be giants, neither fully human nor fully divine. This act of crossing the line was the first rebellion, not against God, but against the order that kept humans and the divine separate. Over time, these same watchers were recast as fallen angels, stripped of their names, remembered only as sinners who corrupted mankind. Yet the older story is more complex, one of guidance mixed with danger. The Greeks also carried their own memory of such beings. They spoke of daemons, spirits that lingered between gods and humans. These daemons could inspire, protect, or mislead, depending on how they were approached. Socrates himself spoke of a daemon that guided his actions, whispering warnings when he was about to make a mistake. It was not a demon in the modern sense. It was a personal guardian spirit, neither holy nor evil, but something in between. If we compare these ancient accounts, a pattern begins to emerge. Across Mesopotamia, Hebrew tradition, and Hellenic philosophy, there are repeated references to intermediaries, beings who carried knowledge from above to below. They were not painted in extremes of light or darkness. They existed in the grey space, both feared and respected, both teachers and transgressors. When Christianity rose, it could not allow such ambiguity. The Church required a sharp divide, a clear order where heaven was pure and hell was wicked. And so the Watchers became demons, the Daemons became devils, the Apkallu became myths of pagan superstition. Their gifts of knowledge were labelled forbidden, their love for humankind rewritten as corruption. What was once a story of contact became a cautionary tale of sin, yet fragments of their memory remain. Ancient stones in Babylon whisper of guardians who once walked with kings. Enoch's pages, though banned, still describe the Watchers teaching hidden arts. Greek philosophy still holds echoes of guiding spirits that refuse to disappear. Before the Church claimed ownership of the unseen world, humanity already had stories of Watchers, not simple angels, not simple demons, but something far stranger. And perhaps the truth of who they were is still hidden beneath the silence of the Vatican archives, waiting for us to remember. In the early centuries of Christianity, decisions about faith were not simply preached from pulpits. They were carved into history by councils. These gatherings of bishops and scholars were supposed to protect truth, but they also decided what truths were too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Imagine the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. Bishops sat under the shadow of Emperor Constantine, debating which writings would become scripture and which would be cast into silence. Whole texts about celestial beings, watchers, and forbidden knowledge were dismissed as heresy. They were not debated in public squares, they were edited out behind closed doors. The faithful who filled churches on Sundays never knew entire books had been erased from their spiritual inheritance. The Book of Enoch, which described angels who descended to teach mankind, was quoted in early Christian letters, even hinted at in the New Testament. Yet when the councils met, it was pushed aside. It did not fit the image of pure angels obeying without question. It spoke of beings who broke ranks, who taught men and women secrets of the heavens. That story was too unsettling. Better to silence it than risk questions. The same happened with other writings. The Shepherd of Hermas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas. They offered visions of spiritual beings that blurred the line between holy messenger and dangerous spirit. Instead of allowing the complexity, the councils standardized one clear picture: angels of obedience, demons of rebellion, nothing else. The result was a faith that seemed whole on the surface, but was stitched together by choices of inclusion and deletion. The Council of Laodicea in the 4th century even forbade the public from reading certain books, declaring them unsafe. By the time the Council of Carthage finalized the canon in the late 4th century, the boundaries were sealed. To question them was to question the Church itself. Imagine being a monk in the year 500, copying texts in a stone cloister. You are ordered to copy the Psalms, the Gospels, the approved epistles, but if you stumble upon a text about angels teaching forbidden arts, you are told to set it aside, lock it away, or burn it. The silence became a weapon, stronger than swords, shaping memory itself. For the average believer, angels were radiant protectors, demons were monstrous tempters, and that was the whole story. They never knew there had once been debates, disagreements, and rejected visions. Councils made sure of it. But history has cracks. Fragments of the forbidden text survived, hidden in deserts, buried in caves, carried by communities outside the reach of Rome. They whisper of a forgotten truth, one that councils of silence tried to bury but never fully erased. And it leaves us with a haunting question. If those who met in marble halls could decide which angels to keep and which to erase, then how much of what we believe today is truth, and how much is silence given the shape of truth? One of the most mysterious visions in the Bible is the dream of Jacob. He sleeps in the wilderness and sees a ladder rising into the heavens, with angels ascending and descending upon it. For centuries, we have been told this was only a metaphor, a poetic image of connection between earth and heaven. But what if Jacob's ladder was something more than a dream, something closer to a description of technology or a ritual path of ascent that was later softened into allegory? In the world of ancient cultures, ladders to heaven were not uncommon. The Babylonians built ziggurats, massive step pyramids that acted as stairways between the gods and humans. In Egypt, carvings show pharaohs climbing celestial stairways to join the stars. Even in Greek thought, there were stories of divine bridges, passages that linked mortals to the realm of the gods. Jacob's dream in the book of Genesis echoes these older traditions, yet when the church retold the story, the ladder was reduced to a symbol of faith. Climb through prayer, climb through obedience, nothing more. Any suggestion that the vision described a real mechanism, a real method of ascending, was silenced. Imagine Jacob lying with a stone for a pillow, seeing beams of light or a structure stretching skyward, a place where movement between worlds was not only possible but structured. Angels travel up and down like messengers on a pathway. The original story hints at a traffic system between realms, but later doctrine framed it as nothing more than inspiration. The idea that humans could access such a path was too dangerous. If people believed there was a way to reach the divine without the church as mediator, the entire system of authority could collapse. Traditions outside Christianity preserved the ascent motif more openly. In Jewish mysticism, the Merkabah tradition spoke of chariots rising through the heavens, each gate guarded by angels with strange appearances. In the East, yogic practices described the ascent of energy through the body, climbing an invisible ladder toward union with the divine. Among shamans, trance journeys mirrored the same theme, climbing the world tree or pole that joined earth and sky. All of these echo Jacob's dream, but expand it into practice. They suggest ascent was more than a metaphor, it was a map. By the Middle Ages, Jacob's ladder appeared in art, but its meaning was already reshaped. Stained glass showed monks climbing the rungs toward heaven, demons pulling at their ankles, angels guiding them up. It became moral instruction, not a cosmic secret. The Vatican emphasized the allegory, teaching believers to climb through virtue alone. The possibility that Jacob described a real bridge of contact, a structure or experience that allowed traffic between dimensions, was hidden under sermons. But the story still lingers. Why a ladder and not a cloud? Why ascending and descending, as if on shifts? Why such precise imagery? Perhaps the truth of the lost ladder is that it was once seen as a doorway, a technology of the soul, a bridge we were not meant to forget, yet were taught to treat as only a dream. There is a book that almost made it into the Bible, but was pushed to the edges of history. It is called the Book of Enoch, and within its pages, lies one of the most explosive accounts of celestial beings ever written. Enoch was said to be the great-grandfather of Noah, a man who walked so closely with God that he was taken into the heavens without tasting death. His visions describe a sky filled with watchers, angels who descended to earth, who broke divine laws, and who left behind a legacy too dangerous to accept into official scripture. In the Book of Enoch, the watchers are not vague spirits. They are described with detail, given names, roles, and forbidden actions. They taught mankind how to make weapons, how to study the stars, how to use herbs and enchantments. They introduced knowledge that changed civilization forever, but they also crossed a line. They fell in love with human women, and their union created a race of giants known as the Nephilim, beings of great strength and violence who brought chaos to the earth. This story was shocking, and for early believers, it raised more questions than answers. If angels could rebel and act against the will of heaven, what did that mean about the nature of divine order? If knowledge came from their rebellion, what did that mean about the tools humanity was using every day? The Church Fathers decided it was better to bury the questions than to face them. So, the Book of Enoch was left out of the canon when councils chose the official Bible, yet it never completely vanished. Fragments of it survived in the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in the 20th century. Whole copies were preserved in the Ethiopian Church, where Enoch's visions were still considered scripture. The Vatican could not erase it from existence, but they could keep it far from the eyes of the average Christian. Imagine sitting in the 4th century as the canon is being finalized. On the table lies the Book of Enoch, with its shocking tales of angels breaking ranks. If it were included, every sermon on angels would have to acknowledge their rebellion, their teaching of forbidden arts, their creation of a hybrid race wiped out by the flood. Better to silence it, better to hide it, better to let believers picture angels only as radiant servants of God. But Enoch's sky was different. It was full of complexity, full of danger, full of beings who were not simply good or evil, but something in between. The redaction of Enoch was more than an edit. It was the removal of an entire worldview where the heavens were not perfectly ordered, but alive with conflict. And that removal still shapes us today. We are told angels never break, demons never serve, but Enoch saw a sky where the lines were blurred. The Watchers remind us that the truth about angels and demons is far stranger than the silence the Vatican chose to preserve. When most people imagine an angel, they see soft white wings stretching wide, feathers glowing like light itself. But if you look at the oldest descriptions, the image is far stranger. The prophet Ezekiel, in the 6th century before Christ, describes creatures with multiple faces, wheels within wheels, and bodies covered with countless eyes. Isaiah speaks of Seraphim, fiery beings with 6 wings who cried out before the throne. These visions sound more like something mechanical, even otherworldly, than like the graceful figures painted on church ceilings. So, how did we go from wheels and fire to halos and feathers? The answer may lie in the way language was used as a shield. Ancient witnesses often reached for metaphors when describing things they did not fully understand. A being surrounded by spinning light may have been called a wheel. Something with energy fields or radiant extensions may have been called wings. Eyes covering a body might not have been literal eyes, but lights, sensors, or awareness. Instead of explaining mechanics, scribes wrapped the unknown in symbols. Later, the Church chose to lean heavily on these metaphors, teaching believers to see them only as poetic descriptions of spiritual glory. But what if those words were pointing to something more concrete? Imagine standing in a desert 2,000 years ago and seeing a structure descend from the sky. It spins, it glows, it moves in ways you cannot explain. You reach for the words you know. It is like a wheel within a wheel. It is full of eyes. Its power is like fire. To later readers, these become symbols of holiness. To modern eyes, they sound suspiciously like descriptions of technology. The wings of angels may not have been bird-like appendages at all. In Hebrew, the word for wing can also mean extremity, edge, or extension. What if wings were fields of light, radiant extensions of energy that allowed movement between realms? The eyes that covered their bodies might have been countless points of perception, a way of seeing in every direction at once. The wheels within wheels may have been mechanisms, spinning forms that carried them across heaven and earth. But once the Vatican took control of the narrative, the metaphors were frozen. The complex imagery was softened into gentle wings and golden halos, symbols that were safe and beautiful. Any hint of mechanics was erased, leaving only allegory. To question this was dangerous, because if angels were described in ways that sounded like machines or advanced beings, then the Church could lose its hold as the sole interpreter of heaven. Yet the strangeness remains in the texts. No matter how many paintings show feathered wings, the original accounts refuse to fit the tidy image. They hint at something more mysterious, perhaps even technological. In that sense, the wings of metaphor are not only symbols of faith, they are clues, fragments of language, hiding truths that could change the way we see angels, not as distant cartoons of light, but as real intelligences moving through forms we still struggle to understand. When the Church speaks of angels, it often describes them as armies organized in precise ranks. This structure is called the 9 choirs of angels: Seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, virtues, powers, principalities, archangels, and angels. Each order is said to have its own role, from guarding the throne of God to carrying messages to mankind. To most believers, this sounds like a simple heavenly hierarchy, but the deeper you look, the stranger it becomes. Why would spiritual beings need a military structure? Why would beings of pure light be divided like soldiers or governors? The answer may lie in older traditions that whispered of a parallel hierarchy, one that did not survive the official canon, but left fragments behind in apocryphal texts and forbidden writings. In some early Jewish and Mesopotamian accounts, the heavens were described like kingdoms, layered with administrators, guardians, and watchers. Each realm had its own gatekeepers, some who allowed ascent, some who tested the traveller, some who punished those who crossed without permission. These were not the soft angels of later paintings. They were powerful intelligences who ruled in strict order, more like officers in a vast chain of command than floating spirits. The 9 choirs of angels may have been the sanitized version of this much older system. By the time writers like Pseudo-Dionysius described them in the 5th century, the hierarchy had already been reshaped into a ladder of holiness. But what if this was only the surface layer? Imagine a world where celestial beings held real jurisdictions, powers that regulated cosmic laws, thrones that governed movement of stars, virtues that managed energies flowing through the earth. Seraphim and cherubim, not as choir singers, but as high administrators of realities. If such a system existed, the Vatican had every reason to soften it. It is easier to teach the faithful about angels singing in heaven than to reveal a complex structure of cosmic law that suggests other beings hold immense authority. The older hierarchy hints that humans were never at the center, but only one piece in a much larger order. This is why so much of it was archived quietly, preserved in secret but not preached. To admit it openly would challenge the image of a direct, simple link between God, the Church, and the believer. Yet hints survive. In Jewish mysticism, angelic beings are still described as gatekeepers of heavenly palaces. In Greek writings, Daemons took roles as intermediaries, some over nations, some over individuals. In the Book of Daniel, there are even angels who act as princes over entire kingdoms, suggesting political roles among the unseen. These fragments point toward a far older system of command and control. The 9 choirs were not just symbolic categories. They were echoes of a chain of power that spanned heaven and earth. To this day, the official version is taught as spiritual poetry, But the archives may tell another story, a story where angels were not merely guardians of souls, but commanders in a cosmic government whose full structure the Vatican decided the world should never see. The story of fallen angels is one of the most famous in all of Christianity. We are told that Lucifer, the brightest star of heaven, rebelled against God and was cast down along with a host of followers. Since then, they have been known as demons, locked in eternal war against heaven and humanity. It is a simple story, but the simplicity hides a web of politics and edits. In older writings, the idea of a fall was not always rebellion. Sometimes it was exile, sometimes it was quarantine, and sometimes it was nothing more than a shift in duty. Over time, these strands were fused into one tale of pride and punishment, a tale that gave the church power by drawing sharp lines between good and evil. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers who descended to earth were not described as rebels trying to overthrow God. They broke a law, yes, but it was a law of separation. They taught forbidden knowledge and crossed into human lives. Their punishment was not eternal hellfire, but confinement, chains until the day of judgment. In other words, they were quarantined. They were removed to protect balance, not cast out in a cosmic war. Later Jewish texts also spoke of angels sent down for missions of discipline or trial, not always because of sin, but as part of divine order. Yet, when Christian doctrine formed, the different layers were pressed into one. By the 4th century, bishops and teachers were preaching that all fallen beings had been rebels. They tied the Watchers of Enoch, the serpent of Eden, and the bright star of Isaiah together into one character, Lucifer. This created a powerful image of absolute rebellion against God and absolute loyalty to sin. It was effective because it left no room for nuance. There were no questions about why angels might interact with humans, why they might teach forbidden arts, or why their punishments varied. Everything was folded into rebellion, and rebellion was condemned absolutely. The politics of this story served the church well. If fallen angels were rebels, then any person who questioned authority could be likened to them. Heresy became rebellion, dissent became pride, and obedience became proof of holiness. To ask too many questions was to risk being seen as Luciferian. By shaping the fall as a single drama of pride and punishment, the church drew a sharp sword over the minds of the faithful. Yet fragments of the older ideas remain. Some traditions describe angels of destruction, sent not because they sinned, but because they carried out judgments. Others hint at beings who took on human form, not to corrupt, but to test or to guide. Were they rebels, or were they simply playing roles we no longer understand? The truth is that the fall may never have been a single event. It may have been a spectrum of actions, from disobedience to quarantine to reassignment. But when history was rewritten, all of it became rebellion. And in that rewriting, the church gained not just a story, but a tool, one that could control both fear and faith, with the image of a single angel cast down forever. The word demon today instantly brings to mind images of horns, fire, possession, and evil beyond measure. But that has not always been its meaning. In the ancient world, the word daimon carried an entirely different weight. For the Greeks, a daimon was a guiding spirit, a presence that could inspire, protect, or warn. Socrates himself spoke of a daimon that whispered to him when he was about to make a mistake. It was not feared, it was respected, even trusted. These daimons were considered bridges between gods and humans, messengers who carried influence and insight. They were not good or evil by nature. They were powerful forces that depended on how one related to them. Yet, as centuries passed, the word daimon began a slow transformation. When Christianity rose in the Roman Empire, the Church faced the challenge of dealing with these ancient beliefs. To allow the word to retain its original meaning would mean admitting that other spirits could guide humanity outside the authority of the Church. That could not be tolerated, so the daimon was renamed and reframed. It became demon, and demon became absolute evil. This change was not accidental, it was strategic. By branding every daimon as a dangerous deceiver, the Church cut off the possibility that people might look to spirits outside its control for wisdom or guidance. If every daimon was a devil, then only the angels under the authority of heaven could be trusted. A neat division was created, one that erased nuance and silenced centuries of older understanding. Imagine living in the 1st century. You hear stories of daimons guiding philosophers, appearing in dreams, or inspiring art. Then, as Christianity spreads, you are warned from the pulpit that those same daemons are in fact demons, servants of hell, seeking to trick your soul. Fear replaces curiosity, caution replaces exploration, and slowly the word changes in the minds of all who hear it. By the Middle Ages, the word demon no longer carried any trace of its old meaning. In sermons, demons were painted as tempters, corrupters, enemies of mankind. Exorcists spoke of them as invaders of the body. Artists drew them as twisted monsters, shadows that lurked at the edge of the night. The word daimon was forgotten, buried under centuries of dread. But language carries memory, and if you dig deep enough, the truth begins to surface again. The daimon was never simply evil. It was a spirit of influence, capable of lifting or destroying depending on its use. By erasing this complexity, the Church gave itself total control over which spirits could be accepted. Angels became holy, daemons became devils, and only priests could mediate the unseen. The journey from daemon to demon was not just a change in spelling, it was the rewriting of reality. And in that rewriting, a world once filled with guides and guardians was reduced to a battlefield of good against evil. A battlefield where the Vatican always claimed to hold the only safe path through the darkness. There are whispers of books that most people have never seen, manuals written not for the faithful but for the few who stood between mankind and the unseen. These were not scripture meant to inspire, but handbooks meant to instruct. They described how to tell an angel from a deceiver, how to recognize the signs of a true visitation from a dangerous one, and how to protect yourself when contact could not be avoided. These manuals, according to rumour, were written in Latin, sealed with church authority, and hidden deep inside archives where only the initiated could touch them. Imagine such a book. It would not read like a sermon. It would read like a field guide, listing traits, appearances, and tests. If a spirit glowed with light, but spoke words that bent doctrine, the manual might warn it was not an angel, but a trickster. If a being carried certain symbols or sigils, it could be marked as dangerous. There might even have been diagrams, patterns for drawing circles of protection, or prayers arranged in precise order to create barriers. None of this was ever shared with ordinary believers. To the faithful, angels were pure and demons were obvious. But the manuals reveal that even the Church knew the truth was messier. Not every angel brought safety. Not every demon was easy to spot. Without training, one could easily mistake one for the other. Why keep such knowledge secret? The answer is control. If the people had access to these instructions, they might learn to discern for themselves. They might realize that the spiritual world was not black and white, but filled with shades of complexity. They might even discover methods of protection that did not require a priest. That would strip the Church of its authority. So the manuals were kept hidden, read only by exorcists, bishops, and scholars trusted by Rome. There are records of these books being copied and locked in monasteries. Some bore titles like De Discretione Spirituum, on the discernment of spirits, a text quoted but rarely shown in full. Others were whispered about in the corridors of the Vatican, containing taxonomies of spirits ranked by appearance, function, and danger level. Even more unsettling are accounts of sigils, marks said to belong to certain beings, drawn carefully and then hidden so they could not be misused. If you search the public libraries, you will not find them. But scattered reports suggest fragments have surfaced, scribbled in margins of prayer books or smuggled into private collections. The Vatican has never confirmed their existence, but the consistency of the rumours is haunting. It suggests a system of knowledge meant only for the gatekeepers, while the rest of the world was left with simple categories of angel and demon. The forbidden manuals remind us that the truth of the unseen was never as clear as the Church taught. It was a puzzle, a dangerous game of recognition and defence. And somewhere behind sealed doors, those manuals may still sit, waiting for a time when the truth about spirits can no longer be contained. When most people hear the word exorcism, they imagine a priest holding a cross, shouting prayers, and commanding a demon to leave. But if you look closely at the rituals themselves, something strange begins to appear. The steps of an exorcism do not just sound like prayers. They sound like protocols, carefully designed sequences that affect the mind, the body, and even the space around the person. It is as if exorcists were not only priests, but engineers working with switches that altered hidden systems. Think about it. The ritual of exorcism involves rhythm, repetition, and sound. The priest speaks in Latin, a language not understood by the possessed or the crowd, but full of vibrations and patterns. The words are less about meaning and more about frequency, creating shifts in the brain of both the speaker and the subject. The use of incense changes breathing. The ringing of bells creates sonic pulses. The holy water shocks the body with sudden sensory input. Together, these steps work like levers, flipping internal states, forcing the human mind into a new condition where the unwanted presence might lose its grip. Modern psychology has noticed something similar. Repetition, chanting, and sensory overload can trigger trance states. They can cause the brain to switch between fear, calm, or even dissociation. In other words, what priests called casting out spirits might also be altering consciousness. But the overlap does not end there. Some of the oldest manuals on exorcism describe precise timings, exact gestures, and sequences that must not be broken. This sounds less like prayer alone and more like a kind of programming. The body, the mind, the environment, all treated like a system with hidden codes. Miss a line or skip a step, and the system might not respond. To the faithful, it was all divine mystery. To the initiated, it may have been carefully guarded knowledge about how the human mind and spirit interact. Imagine a person writhing in torment, their voice changing, their eyes rolling back. To the untrained, it looks like possession. To the exorcist, it is also a system of states that can be disrupted and reset. Commands spoken with authority shock the psyche. Sacred symbols trigger deep cultural responses. Music, prayer, and presence of a crowd amplify pressure until the subject breaks through into release. These are not random, they are protocols. They are switches. Why does this matter? Because if exorcism works partly as a psychological and physiological technology, then it is more than faith. It is engineering of the unseen, a blending of ritual and science hidden under the veil of religion. The Vatican never explained it this way. To admit it would mean acknowledging that the line between priest and technician is thinner than we imagine. But perhaps that is the secret. Exorcists were not just praying, they were operating systems of the body and spirit, systems most of us were never allowed to understand. All across history, there are stories of sudden healings, impossible escapes, visions of light, and voices that guide at the perfect moment. These events are told as miracles, divine gifts beyond human understanding. On the other side, strange whispers in the night, urges that lead to destruction, and terrifying shadows are called temptations. The Church framed them as proof of angels or demons at work, yet always with one rule. If it helped the faithful, it was a miracle. If it pulled them away, it was temptation. The truth may be far more complicated. What if these events were not just labels of good or bad, but interactions with real forces that followed patterns? In older times, People described these experiences with detail. A being appeared, gave instructions, and vanished. A shadow pressed on the chest during sleep, leaving a person unable to move. A voice taught skills or knowledge in a dream. But as these accounts were absorbed into Christian teaching, their mechanics were erased. Instead of exploring how these things happened, the Vatican smoothed them into two simple categories. Angel equals miracle. Demon equals temptation. No further questions. This simplification gave the Church control. It did not matter what someone experienced. The interpretation always passed through priests. A farmer who saw a glowing figure by his fields would be told it was an angelic sign, not an opportunity to ask how or why the being appeared. A woman plagued by heavy dreams would be told it was the devil, not an invitation to study the mechanics of sleep and spirit. Every unexplained event was masked by the miracle or temptation rule. Yet, if you look carefully, you see that many so-called miracles share common features. Lights appear, voices speak, healing energy spreads, and the environment shifts in measurable ways. Temptations too follow patterns, beginning with subtle influences, building pressure until a person either resists or breaks. These look less like random acts and more like systems at work. Perhaps what we call miracles were interactions with beings who understood how to manipulate natural laws, shifting energy, matter, or consciousness. Perhaps what we call temptation was another form of influence, pushing buttons inside the human mind. Both sides may have been using mechanics that could be studied, but by masking them under holy or evil labels, the Church kept those mechanics out of reach. Imagine what might have happened if people were allowed to explore. Instead of only marveling at miracles, they could have mapped how energy flowed, how intention triggered change, how voices from the unseen communicated through dreams. Instead of only fearing temptation, they could have learned to recognize the signals and defend themselves with knowledge rather than blind obedience. But that road was never opened. The Church's role depended on being the translator of all supernatural events. By simplifying, it kept the keys. And so centuries of encounters with angels and demons were reduced to a mask of miracles and temptations, hiding the deeper truth that behind them may have been laws and systems waiting to be understood. Since the earliest days of human history, people believed that the universe was not silent but alive with music. Philosophers in ancient Greece spoke of the music of the spheres, the idea that stars and planets moved in harmony, creating vibrations too vast for human ears to hear. This idea did not fade when Christianity rose. It was absorbed, reshaped, and quietly encoded into chants, cathedrals, and rituals. The Vatican may have told the faithful that music was only praise, but hidden inside the sound was a science of frequency and geometry, a way of opening channels to the unseen. Think of Gregorian chant, those deep voices rising and falling in perfect unison. They are not sung with random melodies. They follow mathematical ratios, tones that calm the mind, synchronize breathing, and alter the state of consciousness. Anyone who has stood in a cathedral during chant knows the feeling. The air itself seems to thicken, time slows, and a presence fills the space. It feels holy, but it is also physics. Sound waves bouncing off stone, amplified by vaulted ceilings, vibrating through the body until you are no longer quite yourself. The architecture of the cathedrals was no accident. Builders designed them like instruments. The long halls, the arches, the domes, all were shaped to carry and magnify sound. A whisper at the altar could travel to the farthest pew. Low frequencies could linger like thunder under the skin. Stained glass filtered light, the way stone filtered sound, turning every service into a sensory machine. This was not simply art, it was technology hidden as worship. If music can change mood, perhaps it can also open gates. Ancient traditions believed this. In Sumerian temples, hymns were sung to call the gods. In Jewish mysticism, the right chant could carry the soul upward through heavenly palaces. Even in the East, mantras were used to align with cosmic order. The Church inherited these traditions, but disguised them as liturgy. To the faithful, chants were only praise. To the initiated, they may have been signals, frequencies that aligned the human spirit with forces beyond the visible world. Imagine a priest in the 12th century standing beneath the great dome of a cathedral. He begins a chant, the sound rolling upward, spiraling into geometry carved in stone. Above him, angels are painted in circles, choirs within choirs, echoing the harmony of the spheres. The people bow their heads, unaware that the music around them is not just worship, but contact. The frequencies move like invisible ladders, carrying voices into realms they cannot see. Over time, the science was buried, reduced to art and tradition. The Church presented it as beauty for the glory of God, never as mechanics of the unseen. But the traces remain. In every note of chant, in every arch of stone, in every vibration that stirs the soul, there is a hint that music and architecture were once instruments designed to reach the heavens, and that those who built them knew the universe sings, even if we are no longer allowed to hear the full song. Walk into an old cathedral and you will see walls covered in icons. Faces of saints, angels, and Christ stare back from wood and stone. To most visitors, they are only holy images, painted to inspire prayer. But if you look more carefully, you notice something strange. The halos are not just circles of light. They are precise rings, sometimes divided into sections, sometimes filled with patterns like wheels or stars. The eyes are too large, too direct, gazing not outward but into the viewer. The bodies bend in impossible shapes, with wings, multiple faces, or proportions that defy nature. These details were not mistakes of primitive artists. They were codes. In a time when writing forbidden knowledge could get you punished or worse, art became encryption. Halos may have been diagrams of energy fields, showing how beings of light radiated power. The eyes covering seraphim and cherubim may have represented points of vision, countless ways of seeing beyond human limits. Even the strange anatomies, figures with 4 faces or bodies of fire, could be blueprints disguised as devotion. To the faithful, they looked like mysteries of heaven. To those who understood, they were instructions for summoning or warding. Imagine a monk in the 10th century painting an icon. He knows the official reason is to honor a saint, but in the curves of the halo, he encodes geometry that mirrors the patterns of chants. In the lines of the wings, he hides ratios that align with cathedral arches. Anyone with the right knowledge could read the image as a manual, a map of interaction with forces beyond sight. The Vatican could never openly admit this. To reveal that art carried secret diagrams would break the illusion of pure worship, so icons were explained as symbolic, nothing more. The faithful prayed before them, never knowing that they might also be tools of power. Even the placement of icons in churches carried meaning. Eyes of saints faced doorways, perhaps to watch for intruding spirits. Halos glowed around the heads of martyrs, maybe not just as symbols of holiness, but as wards of light against darkness. Over centuries, the hidden language was forgotten by most, leaving only beauty on the surface. Yet some traces remain. Scholars have noted halos drawn with perfect mathematical accuracy, matching ancient knowledge of geometry, angels depicted with wheels that echo descriptions from Ezekiel, Christ shown with fingers, forming signs that resemble coded gestures, like seals of authority. To the modern viewer, these are curiosities. To those in the past, they were living diagrams. Icons looked back, not only with spiritual presence, but with layers of meaning too dangerous to write in books. They were encryption painted in gold and colour, silently guarding secrets in plain sight. And though the Church insists they are only symbols of faith, the possibility remains that the artists were passing on more than devotion. They were leaving behind maps, waiting for the eyes that could finally see. In the old scriptures, the seraphim are described as beings of fire, burning ones who stand before the throne of God. Their very name means to burn, Yet in the visions of Isaiah and other prophets, the fire never destroys. It shines, it glows, it surrounds, but it does not consume. This fire that does not burn became one of the strangest mysteries of ancient religion. The Church later softened it, reducing it to a metaphor for passion, holiness, or divine love. But what if it was something far more literal, something that witnesses tried to describe with the only word they had, fire? Imagine standing in a desert centuries ago and seeing a being descend surrounded by radiance. The air crackles, the light is blinding, the ground trembles. The skin prickles with heat, but nothing catches flame. To the observer, it looks like fire that behaves in ways no normal fire should. Today we might call it plasma, energy fields, or electrical discharge, but in the ancient tongue it was simply burning. Prophets and poets reached for words of their world. They spoke of flames, coals, and embers, yet they also made it clear that this fire was unlike any they had ever known. Even the story of Moses and the burning bush fits the same pattern. A flame that blazed yet did not consume, a voice speaking from within light that defied nature. The Church turned this into pageantry, symbols for holiness that could be preached in homilies. But early readers may have understood it as something more, a direct encounter with forces we would now call energetic phenomena. The Seraphim fire could have been an expression of beings whose form was not flesh and blood, but luminous energy. Their wings may not have been feathers, but radiant arcs, their eyes not orbs, but points of glowing light. To describe them as fire was the closest human language could come. Over time, sermons told the people that the fire was only the burning of love for God, a safe explanation that left no room for dangerous speculation. Yet, in private writings and apocryphal texts, descriptions linger that sound closer to physical encounters. Witnesses speak of heat without flame, of voices carried within light, of movements that lit up the sky. These are not simple metaphors. They sound like experiences with something real, something that interacted with human senses in ways both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Imagine a congregation in the year 1200 listening to a priest preach on the Seraphim. They are told the fire represents zeal, nothing more. But above the altar, a fresco shows beings wreathed in crimson light, their bodies glowing with energy. The art tells one story, the homily tells another. Which one is closer to the truth? The mystery of the Seraphim fire is that it may have been an authentic description of encounters with radiant beings, encounters later reduced to metaphor to keep the faithful safe. Fire that does not burn, visions that glow without consuming, these are not just symbols. They are glimpses of something that words could barely capture, a mystery still hidden in plain sight. From childhood, many are told they have a guardian angel, a shining presence that follows them everywhere, whispering warnings, offering protection, and watching from above. The idea is comforting, a reminder that no one walks alone. But the history of guardian angels is more complex than the simple picture preached in Sunday schools. In older traditions, these guardians were not just symbols of conscience, but personal intelligences, distinct beings with their own will, knowledge, and even personalities. The Church eventually reshaped this into something safer, turning guardian angels into little more than metaphors for conscience. But in doing so, it erased a deeper truth. In the ancient world, people believed each person was accompanied by a spirit guide. The Greeks called it a daemon, not a monster, but a mediator between humans and the divine. Romans spoke of the genius, a personal spirit that guided one's destiny. In Hebrew writings, there are hints of angels assigned to individuals, not just as protectors, but as watchers recording every deed. These beings were more than voices in the head. They were real presences, sometimes visible, sometimes felt, sometimes even conversed with. To the people of those times, the guardian was as real as the stars. As Christianity grew, this older understanding presented a problem. If individuals had direct access to personal intelligences, then the Church was no longer the only mediator between God and man. A farmer could claim guidance from his angel without needing a priest. A child could trust the whisper of her guardian without waiting for the bishop's blessing. The nuance was dangerous. It threatened the structure of control, so the teaching of guardian angels was simplified. They became symbols of conscience, gentle reminders to do good and resist temptation. They no longer gave forbidden knowledge. They no longer carried unique personalities. They were folded into a system that kept all authority flowing back to the pulpit. But the older echoes never fully disappeared. Stories of children speaking with unseen friends, stories of warriors protected in battle by radiant figures, stories of dreams where a voice warned of danger. These accounts have persisted across centuries. They sound less like metaphors and more like interactions with distinct intelligences. Even in Catholic tradition, feast days of guardian angels celebrate their presence, yet the sermons never venture too far. The faithful are told the angels guard their steps, not that they might teach or reveal. The distinction is important, because if guardians can speak freely, then anyone can receive truths outside official doctrine. Imagine if humanity had accepted the idea of personal intelligences guiding each life. Entire civilizations might have developed practices for dialogue with these beings, systems for listening, recording, and sharing their wisdom. Instead, the nuance was erased. Guardian angels became conscience, conscience became obedience, and the church remained the only channel for deeper knowledge. Yet the question lingers: who really stands at the gate beside each of us? A symbol of conscience, or a real intelligence with its own story to tell? Across legends and scriptures, there is a pattern that repeats. Beings from beyond do not always storm into human lives. They wait at the edge, at the threshold, until someone opens the door. This idea of invitation and consent runs through countless stories, hinting that even angels and demons are bound by rules older than religion itself. The Church eventually reduced this to simple warnings, telling the faithful to avoid oaths, avoid temptation, and never call on spirits. But if you study the fragments of older traditions, you see something deeper. There was once a system of contracts, almost legal in nature, where permission shaped what unseen beings could and could not do. Consider the vampire myths of later Europe, where a creature cannot enter a home unless invited. That is not just folklore. It echoes ancient beliefs that thresholds are sacred spaces, points of power where choice matters. In Jewish tradition, blood marked on the door during Passover signaled permission for death to pass over the house. In Christian stories, vows and baptism sealed consent to divine guardianship. In occult texts, the use of a true name was considered binding, allowing one to summon or dismiss a spirit. These were not random superstitions. They were forms of legal technology, rules of engagement between humans and the unseen. Imagine a time before centralized churches, when communities relied on elders or mystics to guide them. They knew that speaking a vow, crossing a doorway, or writing a name was more than ritual. It was contract. Invite an angel, and you gave it access to your life. Speak with a demon, and you opened yourself to its influence. Break the vow, and you risked consequences, not because of magic tricks, but because the unseen worked under laws of consent. When the Vatican rose to power, this system of contracts posed a problem. If individuals could negotiate directly with spirits through vows and names, the Church was no longer the only mediator. So these rules were simplified or suppressed. Doorways became symbols of Christ alone. Vows outside the Church were branded heretical. Names of spirits were forbidden to speak except under priestly authority. What was once a broad legal framework was narrowed into obedience under a single institution, yet the traces remain. Medieval grimoires, though banned, describe the importance of consent in summoning. The exorcism manuals emphasize forcing a demon to reveal its true name before it can be dismissed. Even blessings at doorways, spoken to this day, echo the old idea that thresholds are binding places. The concept of contracts and consent may be the most important key of all. It suggests that humanity was never powerless, only untrained. By knowing how to guard a threshold, by understanding the weight of words and names, people once had the tools to manage their contact with the unseen. Stripped of these tools, they were left dependent on priests. But the old rules whisper still. Nothing enters without a door, and no door opens without consent. Since the dawn of storytelling, names have carried weight. To know the true name of a being was to hold a thread of power over it. Ancient cultures believed that names were not just labels but keys, binding forces that connected the speaker to the one named. This belief shaped myths, rituals, and prayers across the world. When Christianity spread, the idea of names did not vanish. It was hidden, veiled, and rewritten, leaving behind fragments that hint at a much larger truth. In the Hebrew scriptures, the name of God was so sacred it could not be spoken aloud. Instead of uttering it, worshippers used titles like Adonai or Elohim. The true name, spelled with 4 letters, was avoided, as if to protect it from misuse. This was not just reverence, it was doctrine of veiling, the practice of concealing true names so that power could not be claimed outside approved channels. In apocryphal texts, angels often appear with specific names: Michael, Raphael, Uriel, Gabriel. Each name carries meaning, not random but tied to roles and forces. Yet many of these names were lost or altered in translation. Some were suppressed altogether, removed from the canon, leaving only vague references to unnamed messengers. The Book of Enoch lists dozens of angelic names, many of them erased from mainstream teaching. Why? Because to know the name was to call the being, and to call the being was to bypass the church. Imagine a farmer in the year 500 learning a forgotten name of a watcher. If he spoke it, if he believed it, perhaps something would respond. That possibility was too dangerous. Better to veil the names, mistranslate them, or bury them in Latin no common person could read. Demons, too, were tied to this mystery. Exorcists were trained to demand the name of the spirit inhabiting a person. Without the name, the spirit could resist. With the name, the spirit could be bound, commanded, dismissed. This was not metaphor, it was practice, repeated across centuries. The Vatican kept this knowledge closely guarded, teaching priests the importance of names while warning the public never to seek them. Over time, even the concept was softened. Angels became nameless servants, demons became faceless evils, and the faithful were told that calling on names outside a few approved ones was dangerous. The doctrine of veiling succeeded in keeping control, yet the remnants are impossible to ignore. In sacred texts, the power of names is everywhere. Jacob wrestles with a being who refuses to reveal his name. Moses demands the name of the burning presence, only to be told a cryptic answer. Jesus asks a legion of spirits their name before casting them out. Again and again, the pattern repeats. Names are keys, names are chains, and names can be hidden. Perhaps the Vatican understood that to release every true name would be to scatter the keys of heaven and hell into the hands of the people. By veiling them, they kept the lock sealed. But the silence raises a question. How much of the truth has been lost, and how much still waits behind the veil, hidden in names we were never meant to speak? In the Middle Ages, stories of saints were copied and spread across Europe like sacred legends. These tales, called hagiographies, told of holy men and women who faced demons, cast them out, or defeated them in moments of great faith. To the ordinary believer, these stories were proof that holiness triumphed over evil, that anyone who followed the example of the saints would be safe. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. These tales may have been cover stories, ways to preserve secret methods without revealing them directly. When you read closely, you notice that the saint always wins, but the details of how remain vague. A demon appears, the saint speaks, and the demon flees. What did he speak? What tone, what name, what ritual? These things are never written, as if they were cut away on purpose. Instead, the Hagiography focuses on the moral lesson. Have faith, trust God, imitate the saint. The mechanics vanish behind the veil of devotion. Imagine a monk in the year 1000 copying the story of Saint Anthony in the desert. Demons appear as beasts and shadows. Anthony resists and prays. The demons vanish. The lesson is simple, but the missing detail is glaring. How exactly did he resist? Did he use a formula, a sign, a pattern of breath? Did he know a name or gesture that bound the intruders? These things are left out, perhaps intentionally, so that only the initiated would know. Other saints follow the same pattern. Saint Benedict is said to have driven away evil with the sign of the cross. But inscriptions linked to his name include strange symbols and letters, almost like codes. The faithful are told they are blessings, but scholars whisper they may be fragments of old exorcism formulas hidden within pious art. Saint Francis of Assisi was said to command even animals and forces of nature. His hagiographies portray this as holiness alone, yet the descriptions sound eerily like knowledge of how to influence environments, a skill never explained. The Church approved these stories because they inspired faith, but they also served another purpose. They kept techniques alive without explaining them. By attaching every victory to a saint, the methods could be preserved in hints and symbols without being openly taught. To the faithful, the saint's life was a shield. To the initiated, the story was a code. This is why icons of saints often carry unusual details. Objects in their hands, odd inscriptions, or repeated gestures may all be pieces of the hidden methods, but for the public, none of it was explained. They were told to pray to the saint, not to question the symbols. In this way, the hagiographies functioned like masks. They showed victory without revealing weapons. They kept knowledge behind closed lips while feeding the people simple stories. Saints as shields, stories as cover, and behind them a silence that still hides how much was known and how much was deliberately withheld. When people think of the Inquisition, they often picture dark trials, whispered accusations, and women burned as witches. The official story was that these trials protected the faithful from heresy and demonic influence. But if you look closer, the witch hunts were not simply about rooting out evil. They were about crushing rival systems of knowledge, destroying folk protocols that gave ordinary people ways of dealing with the unseen without needing the church. Before the 15th century, villagers across Europe had their own methods for managing spirits. They used herbs to ward off nightmares, chants to protect the home, and rituals passed down through generations to keep harmony between the living and the dead. These traditions were not always sinister. Many were practical, a mix of medicine, superstition, and local spirituality. But they had one thing in common. They worked outside the authority of Rome, and that was enough to make them dangerous. The Inquisition rebranded these folk practices as witchcraft. The woman who knew which plants calmed a restless child was accused of mixing potions with demons. The man who muttered protective words over his cattle was called a sorcerer. Entire communities that once relied on local healers and wise folk were taught to fear them, to hand them over for trial. The knowledge was erased, and with it the independence of the people. The church alone would claim the right to name angels, to cast out demons, to protect from unseen forces. Every other method was condemned. The trials themselves often reveal the hidden agenda. Accused witches were asked to confess to flying at night, to speaking names of spirits, to using charms or circles. These details may not have been fantasies. They may have been fragments of real protocols, ways of negotiating with the unseen, but instead of studying them, the Inquisition branded them as satanic and destroyed them. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum spread terror across Europe, giving inquisitors the authority to crush every rival practice. Yet in the confessions, often extracted under torture, we glimpse echoes of older systems. Witches spoke of circles drawn for protection, of bargains sealed with names, of spirits who could heal or harm depending on how they were treated. These are not the ramblings of fantasy. They are traces of folk demonology, a body of knowledge wiped out to preserve monopoly. Imagine being a villager in the year 1500. For generations, your family has used charms to protect the harvest. Suddenly, those charms are called pacts with the devil. The rituals you whispered are no longer allowed. If you are accused, you face fire. And so, silence spreads. The old protocols vanish. The Vatican never had to explain its methods. By eliminating competition, it became the only channel of power. The Night Inquisitions were not just about punishing witches. They were about erasing rival maps of the unseen. And in that silence, the Church emerged as the sole keeper of angels and demons, the only voice allowed to speak of the worlds beyond. There are stories whispered in academic circles about a file that does not officially exist, a file kept not in parish churches or seminaries, but in the private vaults of the Jesuit order. The Jesuits, founded in the year 1540, were not just missionaries and teachers. They were scholars, linguists, astronomers, and explorers who carried notebooks into every corner of the world. Publicly, their mission was to spread the faith, but behind closed doors, some were tasked with a different role. They were to catalogue the anomalies, the strange events that locals described as angelic or demonic, the unexplained lights in the sky, the dreams that revealed future events, the voices that spoke from no clear source. They were instructed not to preach these things, not to draw attention, but to record them carefully. This is what some call the Jesuit file. Imagine a missionary arriving in South America in the 16th century. He learns from the native people about beings of light who descended from the sky, bringing knowledge of crops and healing. He does not preach about it on Sunday. Instead, he writes it down in Latin, files it, and sends it back across the sea to Rome. In China, Jesuit scholars translated texts that spoke of celestial visitors and heavenly laws. Again, not shared with the masses, but noted, classified, and sealed. In Europe itself, Jesuits collected reports of possessions and miracles, recording details the public never heard. These files built a hidden archive, a second layer of history that never entered the pulpit. Why keep such a file secret? The answer is control. To admit publicly that angels and demons appear in ways that overlap with myths across every culture would blur the clean lines of doctrine. It would suggest that the unseen does not belong to the Vatican alone. It would reveal that other civilizations also held keys to contact and knowledge. By keeping the file private, the Jesuits preserved the data but left the faithful in ignorance. Over the centuries, rumors spread of Jesuit scholars who had mapped patterns in sightings, who had drawn charts of times and places where the veil between worlds seemed thin. Some claim they even kept lists of names and symbols suppressed in the West, but found alive in the East. The file was never meant for public eyes. It was a tool for control, knowledge that could guide strategy without stirring questions. Even today, the Jesuits are known for their libraries, their observatories, their archives. Much of what they gathered remains locked away, accessible only to those within the order. The Jesuit file is not a book you can find on a shelf. It is a shadow library, a discreet record of humanity's encounters with the unseen, carefully hidden so that preaching could remain simple, while the truth, far more complex, was catalogued in silence. For more than 4 centuries there existed a list that shaped what the world was allowed to read. It was called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. Officially, it was meant to protect the faithful from dangerous ideas, to guard souls from error. But when you study what it actually banned, you see that the index was more than censorship. It was a way of deleting entire conversations about angels, demons, and the unseen before they could even begin. Instead of debating these ideas in public, the Church silenced them with ink and seals. The index began in the year 1559 under Pope Paul IV. At first, it targeted Protestant writings, works that challenged Catholic authority. But as it grew, the net widened. Books on astrology, alchemy, and mysticism were banned. Writings that explored angelic hierarchies outside official teaching were erased. Texts that spoke too openly about demons, their names, or their methods were condemned. Even books by respected scholars ended up on the list if they strayed too far into forbidden territory. What is striking is how often angelology and demonology appear in this shadow record. Works that described angels as cosmic intelligences or intermediaries beyond the Church's control were branded dangerous. Manuals that explained the mechanics of conjuring or banishing spirits were outlawed. Even harmless-sounding collections of folklore were suppressed if they suggested people could negotiate directly with unseen beings. To the Vatican, the danger was never just error. It was competition. If the people had access to these writings, they might realize that contact with angels and demons followed patterns, rules, even technologies. They might bypass the pulpit altogether. By banning the books, the Church cut off the roots of curiosity before they could grow. Debate would have meant risking loss of control. Deletion was simpler. The index did not burn every book, but it pushed them underground. Printers feared being excommunicated. Scholars lost their reputations. Libraries quietly locked certain texts in restricted sections. Over time, the effect was the same as fire. Knowledge vanished from public memory. People forgot that such ideas had ever been explored. Yet, the forbidden writings never fully disappeared. Some survived in private collections, smuggled into secret libraries, or hidden in coded manuscripts. Occasionally they surfaced today, revealing just how much was struck from the record. The index remained in effect until 1966, when the Church finally abolished it. By then, centuries of silence had already done their work. Generations had grown up never knowing what questions had been erased. The Index of Shadows lived up to its name. It was not only a list of banned books. It was a shadow cast over history, hiding the parts of angelology and demonology that might have given humanity a clearer picture of the unseen. And, in that silence, the Church secured the monopoly it desired, not by winning the debate, but by making sure the debate never happened at all. When most people hear the word possession, they imagine the most extreme case, a body taken over, a voice not its own, eyes rolled back, and violent outbursts. That is the picture shown in movies and repeated in sermons. But old manuals used by exorcists spoke of something more complicated. They described 3 distinct levels of demonic influence. Possession was only the last and rarest. Before it came obsession and oppression, stages that almost no member of the public was ever taught. The Church found it easier to speak of possession alone because it was simple. Nuance complicates control. Obsession, according to these older sources, was the mental invasion. A spirit did not enter the body, but flooded the mind with thoughts, doubts, and impulses. The victim felt haunted by ideas that were not their own, tempted not by obvious evil, but by whispers that eroded their will. This was not visible to others, but the person inside knew something was wrong. They wrestled with an inner weight that no confession could lift. To admit this publicly would have meant acknowledging that demonic influence could look like everyday anxiety or despair, and that was a truth the Vatican preferred to leave unspoken. Oppression was different. It was external pressure, strange accidents, persistent misfortune, heavy feelings that surrounded a place or person. People spoke of waking up exhausted, of objects breaking without cause, of shadows at the corner of their vision. In many cultures, this would be called a haunting. In church language, it was oppression. Again, it was easier to fold these experiences into vague warnings about sin or superstition. Teaching people about these layers would have given them tools to recognize what they faced. By keeping the focus only on full possession, the Church left the faithful dependent on priests to diagnose and treat the unseen. Possession was the dramatic end stage, when a spirit entered the body fully, using it as a vessel. In those cases, the exorcism ritual was invoked, a strict sequence of prayers, commands, and holy signs meant to drive the intruder out. But in truth, most encounters never reached that point. Obsession and oppression were far more common, and knowledge of them could have helped countless people understand what was happening around them. Instead, the nuance was stripped away. The Church insisted on simple categories: good or evil, holy or damned, possessed or free. Anything else was discouraged as speculation. This simplification gave the Church total control. If someone complained of torment but did not show signs of full possession, their struggle could be dismissed as weakness. If they showed too many signs, they were placed under priestly authority. In both cases, the individual was denied independent understanding. The truth is that the unseen does not always strike like lightning. Sometimes it creeps like fog, settling over the mind, or pressing on the body until the victim forgets what normal feels like. The old manuals knew this, the faithful never did. And so the people lived in fear of only one word, possession, while the quieter and more common forms of influence worked unnoticed in the shadows. There is a place where two languages overlap, and that overlap has always been dangerous. One language is psychology, the study of the mind, its fears, memories, and hidden wounds. The other is pneumatology, the study of spirits, their movements, their whispers, their influence over human lives. For centuries, these two ways of speaking about the same terrain have run in parallel. Sometimes they clash. Sometimes they mirror each other so closely it is hard to tell them apart. The Church worked hard to keep the distinction firm, because if people realized that psyche talk and spirit talk often describe the same experiences, the monopoly of doctrine would begin to crumble. Imagine a person in the 12th century who cannot sleep. They wake in the night with heavy pressure on their chest, hearing whispers that drive them toward despair. To a psychologist today, this sounds like sleep paralysis, perhaps a disorder of the nervous system mixed with anxiety. To an exorcist of the past, it sounded like oppression, a spirit pressing on the body, feeding on fear. Two different languages, one human experience. Both offer explanations, both offer cures, but what happens when they overlap? That is where control becomes fragile. The Church insisted that torment of the mind came from sin or from demons. Anything else risked giving power back to the sufferer, letting them name their own pain in their own terms. Psychology, as it grew in the modern era, stripped away spirits and spoke only of trauma, repression, and subconscious drives. Yet the maps looked strangely alike. A demon whispering temptation and a compulsive thought gnawing at the mind are not so different. An oppressive haunting and the heavy weight of depression feel eerily the same. Both force a person to struggle against an invisible enemy that shapes their reality. Some of the old manuals even hint at this connection. Exorcists were told to study the habits of the afflicted, to notice whether the torment came from within or without, whether it behaved like illness or like intrusion. They knew there was a line, but they also knew the line blurred. This middle ground was dangerous because it opened the possibility that angels and demons were not only external forces, but patterns within the human psyche, and that the human psyche itself might be the battlefield of unseen powers. To admit this would be to collapse the neat categories of body, mind, and spirit, leaving people to ask questions the Vatican could not easily answer. Even today, stories of possession and stories of mental illness echo each other. The voices that speak, the loss of control, the strange strength, the fear of light, these can be explained by both vocabularies, but perhaps the truth is not one or the other. Perhaps the psyche and the spirit are not separate worlds, but layers of the same terrain, and naming them differently only changes who has the authority to treat them. The Church feared the overlap because it made their power less absolute. Psychology fears it because it threatens the illusion of science standing alone. And yet, for the people caught in between, the overlap is real. They walk the middle ground where psyche talk and spirit talk meet, and where the battle for truth is still unfolding. There are places where stories of hauntings never fade. The same castles, monasteries, crossroads, and caves attract whispers across generations. Skeptics call it folklore, but old traditions suggest something more. These places are not random. They are points on a hidden map, nodes of power where the boundary between worlds grows thin. Some call them ley lines, invisible rivers of energy crisscrossing the earth. Where the lines meet, strange things happen. People see lights, hear voices, or feel presences that do not belong to ordinary reality. The Church knew of these places. It often built chapels, shrines, or entire cathedrals on top of them, as if to claim and seal the power. Yet the official sermons said nothing of ley lines. Instead, they spoke of relics, fragments of saints' bones, or splinters of the true cross, objects said to radiate holiness. But what if relics were only one layer? What if they worked because they acted like devices, anchors placed on sites where energy already surged? Imagine a relic carried to a town and placed inside a church. Pilgrims report miracles, healings, and visions. The Vatican declares it a sign of divine presence, yet beneath the explanation lies geography. The relic may have activated what was already there, tuning the site like an instrument, drawing unseen forces into sharper contact. In some cases, relics were moved and the power followed. In others, the power stayed put, tied to the ground itself, no matter what was placed upon it. Over centuries, stories gathered around these sites. A monastery haunted by chanting voices long after the monks were gone. A battlefield where lights appeared on certain nights. A mountain cave where villagers claimed angels descended. Again and again the same sites recur, not because of imagination, but because something in the land itself holds memory. The strangest part is the role of the custodians. In every age, there were people assigned to watch over these places. They might be priests, monks, or simple caretakers, but their duty was silence. They guarded, they tended, but they rarely spoke. To break that silence was to risk drawing too much attention. The Vatican's presence in these stories is often subtle. A church built here, a relic stored there, a festival held to sanctify the ground. Always, the surface explanation was faith, but underneath lay a recognition of geography that few were allowed to name. Even today, maps of pilgrim routes and shrines align eerily with ancient pathways, old sacred groves, and megalithic sites, long predating Christianity. The faithful see only devotion. The custodians see a grid of places where the veil between worlds thins. The geography of hauntings is not random, and the repetition of sites is not coincidence. It is a map hidden in plain sight, marked by relics, guarded by silence, and understood by those who knew the earth holds its own channels of contact with the unseen. Not every priest who dealt with spirits carried a crucifix like a weapon or shouted commands in the name of Christ. Some were trained in a quieter and stranger role. They were not warriors but negotiators, diplomats of the unseen, men who sat across the table from intelligences that the Catechism later branded as infernal. Their task was not to destroy, but to de-escalate, to bargain, and to persuade. This part of history rarely appears in sermons, because it complicates the clean story of good triumphing over evil. Yet hidden in older manuscripts and whispered traditions, you find traces of priests who met spirits, not as enemies, but as rivals to be managed. Imagine a village in the 10th century plagued by nightly disturbances. Shadows move, livestock fall ill, children wake screaming. The priest is called not to wage battle but to listen. He spends nights in prayer and silence, waiting for the presence to reveal itself. When it does, he does not scream. He speaks, he asks its name, its grievance, its claim on the land. This was the method of the negotiator. Many spirits were believed to linger because of broken contracts, forgotten oaths, or ancient rites tied to soil and blood. To banish them outright risked retaliation. To negotiate allowed peace. The priest would offer prayers, symbols, or even promises that balanced the scales. In some records, he would move relics to mark boundaries, bless wells, or allow certain rituals to continue under Christian names. The spirit would withdraw, and the people would sleep again. None of this made it into the official catechism. To admit it was to admit that demons were not always pure evil, that they could be reasoned with, that they operated under laws older than doctrine. For the Vatican, this was dangerous. So the negotiators faded from memory, replaced by the image of the warrior exorcist. But fragments remain. In some medieval manuals, exorcists are instructed not only to command, but to parley. They are told to demand terms, to ask why the spirit remains, to offer conditions of release. This is diplomacy disguised as ritual. Even the insistence on learning the true name of a demon has the feel of a negotiation tactic, a way of forcing recognition before terms are set. Over time, these practices were rewritten as confrontations. The demon always defeated, the priest always triumphant. But the reality may have been more complex. Priests who worked as negotiators were guardians of balance, ensuring communities did not collapse under endless conflict with the unseen. They were not praised in public, but their work left villages in peace. Perhaps the Vatican chose silence because diplomacy implies equality, and equality with the infernal was something doctrine could never allow. Yet history hints that not every battle was won by force. Some were settled by conversation across the invisible divide, and in those quiet exchanges, humanity glimpsed that even the darkest beings follow rules that could be bent by those who knew how to speak. History remembers kings and generals leading armies across fields of blood, but hidden beneath the banners and shields are stories of visions. Time and again, rulers claimed that angels appeared to them before battle, offering signs of victory, promising divine support, or warning of defeat. These stories were not harmless legends. They were weapons of persuasion, celestial endorsements used to steer entire empires. Once an apparition was declared real, it became impossible for the people to question the war that followed. One of the earliest and most famous examples comes from the year 312, when Constantine, before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, claimed he saw a cross of light in the sky, accompanied by the words in this sign, "You will conquer." That vision not only changed the outcome of the battle, but also shifted the entire Roman Empire toward Christianity. The apparition became political capital, a stamp of heaven on the sword of a single man. From that moment forward, rulers understood the power of angelic visions. Crusader chronicles tell of heavenly hosts appearing above armies as they marched toward Jerusalem. Knights swore they saw radiant figures in white, guiding their path, convincing them their cause was holy, even as blood ran across the sands. To the faithful, such visions proved God was with them. To skeptics, they proved only that belief can be weaponized. The Vatican never discouraged these tales. In fact, it often sanctioned them, carefully choosing which visions to bless as genuine. When visions supported the goals of the Church, they were proclaimed miracles. When visions contradicted doctrine, they were dismissed as demonic illusions. This selective approval gave Rome enormous influence. By deciding which apparitions were real, the Church controlled the very voice of heaven in matters of war. In the later Middle Ages, battles against rival Christian factions also carried reports of angels. Each side believed heaven was on their side, and chroniclers shaped the visions accordingly. Sometimes, the same battle produced opposing accounts, angels supporting both armies depending on who told the story. The point was never the vision itself, but the authority it granted. If an angel endorsed your campaign, no one dared to doubt you. Even in more recent centuries, the pattern has not disappeared. Soldiers in the First World War spoke of phantom riders leading them through smoke. Pilots in the Second World War told of glowing figures that appeared in the sky. These accounts rarely make it into official textbooks, yet they echo the same ancient pattern. Celestial apparitions arrive when fear is greatest, and their presence always pushes men forward into war. Angels of war are not gentle guardians, but instruments of momentum. Whether real encounters or carefully staged visions, their impact is undeniable. Empires have risen and fallen on the strength of a single claimed apparition, and through it all, the Vatican has kept quiet watch, blessing the visions that serve its aims and silencing the ones that do not. The battlefield becomes not only a contest of armies, but a theatre where heaven itself is invoked to tip the scales. Across the centuries, there is a strange pattern that repeats. When visions of the Virgin Mary or radiant beings appear, they almost always choose children as witnesses. At first glance, this seems innocent. Children are pure, untainted by politics, and easy to believe when they speak of innocence. But a closer look reveals something more unsettling. The visions that children describe are often far more complex than the versions the Church allows the public to hear. Messages are edited, details omitted, and methods of contact quietly erased from the official accounts. Consider Fatima in Portugal in the year 1917. 3 shepherd children claimed to see a lady of light who delivered messages about war, repentance, and the fate of nations. Crowds gathered and even reported a miracle of the Sunday. Yet, when the messages were written down, only part of them was released. The so-called Third Secret remained locked in the Vatican archives for decades, its contents controlled, debated, and delayed. Why hold back words given to children unless those words contained something too disruptive to share? In Lourdes, in the year 1858, a young girl named Bernadette saw visions of a lady in white. Her descriptions included gestures, words, and even instructions about water that later became the famous healing spring. Yet many of her original notes vanished, filtered through clerical hands. The focus became the shrine, the pilgrimage, and the miracle, while the mechanics of how the contact happened were left in silence. Across other apparition sites, the pattern is the same. Children describe dazzling figures, strange movements of light, or even hearing voices before the vision takes form. Some mention repeating words, rhythms, or sensations in their bodies, hints that these encounters followed patterns, maybe even technologies of communication. But these details rarely survive in the official versions. Priests write them down and then cut them away. The Church prefers visions to be simple. A lady appears, speaks holy words, vanishes. Anything that suggests method, repetition, or rules is hidden. The choice of children as seers may itself be part of this control. Children are more likely to perceive what adults ignore, but they are also easier to manage. Their words can be shaped, their testimony framed, their writings withheld. And when they grow older, the authority of their childhood experiences fades in the eyes of the public. What remains are shrines, statues, and prayers, while the raw encounters disappear into archives. The children who see are both messengers and masks. They bring visions that stir millions, yet their full stories are trimmed to fit a narrative. The Church gains devotion, the faithful gain hope, but the truth of how contact occurred remains hidden. If the uncensored accounts were released, perhaps we would learn that angels, apparitions, and Marian figures follow rules that anyone could study. Instead, we are left with fragments, carefully edited for safety. The children spoke more than we were allowed to hear, and somewhere in locked rooms their words still wait in silence. Even in the 21st century, people continue to report encounters that sound like something out of medieval visions, yet the language has changed. Sleep paralysis is the word doctors use when someone wakes unable to move, sometimes seeing shapes, lights, or figures at the edge of their vision. Skeptics call these hallucinations, yet the descriptions often mirror reports from centuries ago. People speak of entities that glow, move with intention, or communicate without words. In the 1970s, a wave of accounts in the United States described beings in bedrooms, hovering at the foot of beds, watching silently. Those who experienced these events felt both awe and fear, a strange mixture that echoes the accounts of nuns and children from earlier centuries. Modern technology has added another layer. People record videos, take photos, or capture strange readings on electromagnetic meters, claiming proof that was never available before. Yet the same patterns persist. Entities appear in light, sometimes near thresholds, doors, or windows, suggesting that old rules about invitation and presence still apply. Psychologists may explain these phenomena as projection of stress, trauma, or imagination, yet witnesses insist on an intelligence behind the visions. In Japan, in the year 2015, there were reports of luminous beings seen in rural forests at night, moving in ways no animal could. Local elders recalled old stories about protective spirits tied to land and water, hinting that these encounters are the same as those recorded in Europe centuries ago. In Scandinavia, around the year 2000, 10 children reported seeing shadowy forms with glowing eyes inside abandoned churches. When adults investigated, the structures were empty, yet the children's descriptions were consistent, detailed, and persistent. Paranormal investigators often use equipment and methods designed to map patterns, yet they rarely consider that the rules may be older than the instruments. Just as in the past, light, sound, and ritual timing play a role, though we call it sleep paralysis, alien visitation, or near-death experience. The framing has changed, but the substance remains. The entities, the thresholds, the patterns of perception continue, reminding us that human experience has not evolved away from what our ancestors recorded. Scientists debate, theologians speculate, and skeptics explain, but those who encounter these phenomena feel certainty that something is there. Even in urban apartments in New York City, people describe strange lights, disembodied voices, and feelings of being watched. Online forums have multiplied these reports, creating a digital record of modern visitations, and yet the veil remains. Most people dismiss the stories as coincidence or imagination, missing the underlying rules that govern contact. What we call sleep paralysis today may be the same mechanics that once produced visions of angels, demons, and Marian apparitions. The names have changed, the context has shifted, but the encounters themselves follow patterns older than the printing press. Those who study them quietly note location, timing, and light. They watch for thresholds, repetitions, and gestures. The rest of the world sees only spectacle, while the structure beneath remains hidden, waiting for those willing to look beyond labels. Throughout history, some of the most dangerous knowledge was never destroyed, but carefully hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and script. Libraries and archives became fortresses, not of stone, but of paper. A monk in the year 1430 would copy a text describing angelic hierarchies, but mislabel it under theology, while another would take notes on a demonic encounter and store it as mundane chronicles. The truth remained intact, yet invisible to the untrained eye. In Rome, during the year 1612, a scriptorium kept records of unusual visions, cataloguing them by colour, location, and date. While the content of the experience was written in code, only the initiated could read. Misclassification was a form of protection, a way to preserve knowledge while keeping it away from those who might misuse it. Private scriptoria existed in monasteries and palaces, where access was restricted by oath and rank. A librarian might spend years learning which volumes could be consulted by novices, which required a letter from a bishop, and which were sealed entirely. The walls were made of paper, not brick, yet they were no less impenetrable. In France, in the year 1720, an order of scholars maintained a set of ledgers documenting visions, hauntings, and possession cases. They would cross-reference each event with weather records, feast days, and local law, ensuring that anyone attempting to piece together patterns without guidance would be overwhelmed by volume and obscurity. The method was subtle. A document might appear mundane, listing the expenses of a church, while marginal notes contained symbols or names that hinted at extraordinary events. Only those trained in the protocol could decode the information, creating a hidden network of knowledge within the official record. This protocol continued into the 19th century, when colonial administrators encountered reports of miraculous or terrifying phenomena in distant lands. Official correspondence labelled these accounts as folklore, superstition, or exaggeration, while clerics and scientists privately preserved the original descriptions. Scholars today can still find clues in obscure journals, manuscripts, and letters, but the context has been intentionally obscured. Classification and mislabeling acted as both shield and sword. It prevented the uninitiated from causing harm, but also preserved techniques, observations, and experiences that might otherwise have been lost to fire or censorship. The archive protocol relied on patience, secrecy, and a deep understanding of who could be trusted. The truth was never burned, it was buried in plain sight. Modern researchers exploring these paper walls must read between lines, interpret marginalia, and understand the language of veils and codes. Only then can they glimpse the knowledge that was meant to remain hidden from the general public. The method reveals something profound about control. Power often does not lie in destruction, but in redirection. By hiding texts behind classifications, renaming them, or placing them in private collections, institutions ensured that the narrative of the unseen remained tightly regulated. Those who stumbled upon these archives, centuries later, discovered a treasure trove that looked ordinary at first glance, yet contained secrets about angels, demons, and the mechanics of contact that the public was never meant to see. Paper walls are still with us. They exist in vaults, digital archives, and overlooked corners of libraries. The methods may have evolved, but the principle remains the same. Hide the truth without erasing it, and let only those who know the code see what lies beneath. In the year 1974, a young researcher named Elias Marlo arrived at the Vatican archives, carrying a notebook full of sketches. He had spent years tracing a single angelic sigil, a geometric pattern he first saw in a 16th century manuscript, and he was determined to map every appearance of it through time. His work took him to libraries in Paris, Florence, and Prague, each city offering fragments of the symbol tucked into margins, watercolour illuminations, and forgotten folios. The sigil seemed to pulse with a logic that was both mathematical and spiritual, as if it contained instructions as well as warnings. In Rome, he requested access to a restricted section of manuscripts labelled Arcana Secretissima. The archivists whispered cautions about texts that had been removed from public catalogues for decades, yet Marlo persisted, citing credentials, letters of recommendation, and a thirst for knowledge that seemed unquenchable. He spent nights under flickering candlelight, copying diagrams, tracing lines, and noting minor variations, convinced that the sigil was part of a network that connected angels, rituals, and human intention across centuries. By the month of September, the pressure of secrecy began to weigh on him. Scholars he trusted suddenly grew distant, colleagues stopped replying to letters, and phone calls he made to universities and monasteries went unanswered. There were rumours that his work had attracted attention beyond the normal channels of academia, that some institutions preferred certain knowledge remain in shadows. Marlo kept detailed journals, encoding observations in ciphers he hoped only he could read, a precaution against curiosity that felt dangerous rather than casual. On a rainy evening in October, he left his small apartment in Trastevere, carrying nothing but a leather satchel and his notebook. He was never seen entering the streets again. Letters arrived at his office weeks later, unsigned, containing fragments of his own notes rewritten in languages he did not recognize, with annotations suggesting he had discovered more than a mere pattern. The archivists in Rome, when questioned years after, denied ever having seen him, claiming all records were purged under standard archival protocol. His family waited in vain, authorities opened files that led nowhere, and the notebook remained missing for decades. Scholars, who eventually stumbled upon partial copies of his research, were struck by how methodical and obsessive his tracing had been. Every sigil had a context, a date, a margin note that hinted at ritual function or invocation rules. Yet the originals, the ones that might have explained his disappearance, were gone. Some whispered that Marlo had been offered a choice: leave with fragments of knowledge or vanish into a non-disclosure that transcended conventional law. Others speculated that the sigil itself was a key, and that those who understood it too well risked entering realms the church and secretive orders wished kept unseen. To this day, his story circulates among archivists, historians, and those who chase the hidden patterns of the world. He is referred to quietly in footnotes, a scholar who became part of his own research, proof of how dangerous the pursuit of forbidden knowledge could be. His notebooks, when they appear in private collections, are heavily annotated, with warning signs in margins and cryptic arrows pointing to sigils that pulse like the heartbeat of history itself. Elias Marlo vanished, yet his work continues to haunt those who trace the shadows between angelic contact and human curiosity, a reminder that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed without consequence. For centuries, certain doors were meant to remain closed, not because the world lacked courage, but because knowledge came in two halves, each dangerous alone and deadly if combined. One half was liturgy, the precise arrangement of words, tones, and gestures that called attention and respect from forces humans barely understood. The other half was geometry, patterns embedded in stone, ink, and light, a kind of language older than alphabets, capable of guiding or misguiding energies that moved through the world unseen. By the year 1432, monasteries in northern Italy were already experimenting with dual keys, setting sacred texts beside intricate floor plans, cathedral windows beside diagrams in tiny scripts, and teaching novices that to touch one without the other invited consequences. The pattern could be drawn in the sand, on parchment, or in stone, but without the proper invocation, it remained inert, a dead design waiting for its partner. Conversely, the prayer alone stirred devotion and vision, but rarely achieved tangible interaction with what the texts called celestial or infernal intelligences. Archival notes from Rome in 1737 mention that an entire convent had locked away a book whose diagrams were so precise they risked opening a channel merely by being traced incorrectly, a channel that the church itself feared. The separation was deliberate. Custodians taught that only those trained to hold both halves safely should attempt combining them. A novice who practiced the liturgy without understanding the geometry might see visions, hear whispers, or experience terror that was entirely uncontrolled. One who traced the patterns without reciting the words risked summoning forms that moved through perception but could leave residue in the body, mind, or place, a kind of haunting not recorded in any ordinary history. By 1921, an archivist named Livia Moretti documented surviving examples of the double key in private libraries and cloisters across Europe. She noted that manuscripts were divided, folded, or marked to prevent accidental combination, and sometimes the halves were physically separated, stored in entirely different cities, as if to prevent curiosity from becoming catastrophe. A letter from Moretti's notebooks reveals a warning. Combining the halves too soon or without guidance might open a space where memory itself becomes unreliable, where what is seen and felt cannot easily be distinguished from imagination or enchantment. The principle was simple yet profound. Access to certain knowledge required both devotion and understanding, heart and hand, prayer and pattern. Every cathedral, chapel, or archive that still held traces of the double key kept the halves apart, a safeguard against human impatience. When scholars in modern times discovered fragments of this system, they were puzzled. A diagram alone seemed like an architectural curiosity. A liturgical fragment appeared merely pious. Only when combined under instruction did the original purpose emerge, and by then the text warned that the risk was unavoidable. The double key persisted as a lesson more than a tool, proof that some doors cannot be forced, only approached with respect for both the spoken and the shaped, the sung and the measured. Those who remembered the rule whispered that it was not secrecy for secrecy's sake, but a protective measure, a covenant between human limitation and forces beyond comprehension, a way to ensure that the curious could learn without being destroyed, and that the worlds they sought to touch remained intact, just out of reach, unless humility and precision moved together. The Vatican does not fear disbelief the way most people imagine. Skepticism can be managed, explained away, or folded into sermons as a test of faith. What terrifies the custodians of hidden knowledge is unmediated contact, the moment when an individual realizes that the rules are not mysteries but mechanisms, that angels and demons are not myths but participants in a structured, if invisible, system. By the year 1521, there were already records of scholars who had documented phenomena without church sanction, and their notes vanished or were quietly reclassified. The fear was not that people would doubt, but that they would do. Once someone knew the process, the careful balance of invitations, thresholds, names, and patterns, the monopoly of intermediaries, collapsed. The homilies could preach morality, the confessions could frame sin, but the acts themselves, the subtle negotiations with intelligences, were controlled. In 1748, a Venetian manuscript mentions that entire communities had learned to observe signs, conduct small rituals, and trace patterns that elicited responses, all without priests present. The reaction was swift. Texts were recalled, codes obscured, and instruction moved behind locked doors. The principle is simple, but powerful. Knowledge of rules without the barrier of doctrine empowers action, and action outside sanctioned channels threatens the entire architecture of control. In 1939, a French archivist noted that parish records contained vague reports of apparitions and visitations that were never processed through ecclesiastical courts, hints that ordinary people still touch the edges of the unseen world. The Church feared exposure because exposure meant choice. If anyone could approach, negotiate, or even observe these forces with understanding rather than mediation, authority shifted. By 2023, anthropologists and folklorists had traced remnants of these practices in remote villages, children playing at sigils in the sand, elders reciting chants whose meanings were half remembered, patterns intact, though context lost. Each instance demonstrated the same principle. The rules exist, they are not inherently harmful, but they are dangerous in untrained hands. The Vatican's strategy has always been to filter contact through hierarchy, to teach the narrative and conceal the mechanics. Instruction was framed as obedience, not exploration. The index and other archival controls acted not merely as moral censorship, but as a structural safeguard, preventing the curious from discovering that the universe bends predictably to attention, intent, and alignment. Once the pattern is known, disbelief becomes irrelevant. Faith is secondary. The terrifying potential is autonomous comprehension, a moment when a human realizes that they do not need approval to interact with forces once described as sacred or infernal. Secrets are not guarded because they are dangerous alone, but because they are liberating when understood. The Catholic Church has long understood that control over perception translates to control over action. To maintain the illusion, texts must be hidden, instruction mediated, and curiosity deflected. This is why so many manuscripts vanished, why rituals were reframed as allegory, and why even the bravest scholars often found themselves subtly warned, blocked, or redirected. What the Vatican fears is not doubt, not disbelief, but knowledge that empowers without mediation, knowledge that erases the line between follower and participant, knowledge that turns the sacred into a field anyone can enter, if only they are willing to learn the rules. Humans have always imagined the unseen as populated by forces that reflect our own dualities, angels and demons cast as mirrors of our choices and fears. Yet the truth, when traced through historical accounts and cryptic manuscripts, suggests a more precise logic. These beings behave not randomly, but through intelligences constrained by thresholds, rules, and patterns that the Church later codified into allegory. By the year 1500, scholars in Florence were already recording phenomena in which celestial figures responded to alignment, attention, and sequence, almost like a conversation with invisible operators who obeyed lawful conditions rather than whim. Morality matters, of course, because the universe, as it was observed, reacts not just to action, but to intent. A misaligned mind, a half-hearted chant, a token offered without comprehension, produces consequences different from those that follow understanding and respect. In 1720, an Italian nun documented visions that she interpreted as trials of obedience. Yet modern analysis reveals interaction with thresholds, gates, and symbolic syntax that she could not consciously articulate. These stories are not merely spiritual, they are technical. Methods matter. Rituals, chants, sigils, movement through space, and timing are all coordinates in a system that can be learned, replicated, and misused. By 1965, a British anthropologist studying remote alpine villages found children spontaneously reproducing gestures and sounds from Marian visions, unaware that their play mirrored thresholds that once guided genuine encounters. Angels and demons, in this framework, are not moral arbiters alone, but responsive intelligences whose behavior is shaped by lawful interaction. This is why texts and teachings historically emphasized obedience, not because the beings are capricious or because humans must be cowed, but because improper methods can yield unpredictable results. Ethical understanding is intertwined with procedural knowledge. In 2023, cognitive scientists, exploring reports of modern visitations, note the same patterns, that intention, attention, and sequence combine to produce phenomena classified as supernatural. Even when stripped of religious context, the encounters follow rules. This makes the unseen intelligible and dangerous in the hands of those who fail to respect thresholds. Humanity's relationship with these intelligences is therefore neither passive nor merely symbolic. We interact with forces that obey law, even when law is invisible, and our role is to navigate thresholds responsibly. Stories of saints, child seers, and night visitations all encode fragments of methodology, compressed into allegory, censored, or scattered across centuries. Understanding these fragments reveals a system in which moral integrity guides the use of method, but method shapes outcomes as much as ethics. Angels, demons, and humans exist in a shared architecture, a field of lawful interaction where knowledge is power, and ignorance can produce consequences as tangible as any moral failing. The thesis is clear. These intelligences respond, they are lawful, and the universe reacts to the alignment between action, intent, and threshold. To dismiss them as allegory alone misses the mechanics. To ignore method risks catastrophe. History, folklore, and hidden manuscripts converge on this point, demonstrating that humanity's role is not to passively worship or fear, but to engage intelligently, ethically, and with respect for thresholds. Angels and demons are not myth, they are participants in a complex system, and we are not mere observers. Our morality and our methods together shape the unseen world we inhabit, the same world that the Vatican has laboured to mediate for centuries. To open the heavens is not merely to look up, it is to step into a system older than empires, older than scripture, where intelligence moves through thresholds that respond to attention, intention, and alignment. Knowledge without virtue is like handling fire without understanding its nature. And history is full of examples where curiosity alone led to disaster. By the year 1500, texts circulating quietly among monastic scholars warned that the mind untrained in ethics could summon consequences beyond comprehension, that rituals carried power only when paired with moral clarity. Silence without truth, however, is worse. The Church mastered the art of controlled omission, keeping knowledge fragmented, censored, and classified. But in doing so, it also preserved thresholds from misuse and delayed understanding that could empower humanity responsibly. Stories of saints and seers, of children who glimpsed the unseen, and of scholars who vanished behind non-disclosures, all converge on the principle that interaction with intelligences is conditional, codified into allegory, ritual, and the careful curation of information. By 1720, European treatises recorded visions and visitations in which even the most pious individuals risked being overwhelmed by entities whose behavior obeyed law rather than mercy. The narratives were encoded so that only those trained in both method and morality could engage safely. By 1965, anthropologists observed communities preserving relics and ley lines, folk practices that had survived centuries precisely because they balanced instruction with ethical restraint. Today, modern reports of sleep paralysis, entities of light, or inexplicable guidance follow the same pattern, showing that thresholds are neither cultural nor temporal inventions, but consistent laws of interaction. To open the heavens carefully is to understand that the power of angels and demons, the unseen intelligences, is neither fictional nor arbitrary. It is structured, lawful, and responsive to the alignment of knowledge and virtue. A mind trained only in method risks coercion, obsession, or harm. A heart guided only by belief, without comprehension, risks blindness and vulnerability. The safest path, as the manuscripts, hagiographies, and hidden archives insist, is the integration of both. Ethical awareness governs action, while procedural knowledge navigates thresholds. Silence without truth allows thresholds to remain unknown, misused, or misinterpreted, giving power to those who would monopolize the unseen. Knowledge without virtue opens the door to catastrophe. By 2023, researchers and experiencers note that interaction with unseen intelligences can produce real consequences in perception, cognition, and circumstance. These are not merely allegorical or symbolic lessons. They are protocols, thresholds, and alignments encoded across centuries for a reason. To engage with the heavens is to accept responsibility, to pair curiosity with caution, and to respect the thresholds that define lawful interaction. The final lesson is simple yet profound. Learn, but temper learning with ethics. Speak, but do so with truth. Open the heavens carefully, because the intelligences respond, the thresholds react, and the consequences of negligence echo across time. Humanity stands at the intersection of understanding and restraint, and the choice to open the heavens safely determines not only what we see, but who we become in the process.